Wait for me. Hold on.
No, let's have him practice it once.
He's got it. Downboard a little bit. There you go. Do it, Nicholas.
Marker.
Wow.
Perfect.
Oh, great.
Except for Brian's ears.
It's all good. Okay, you can bring it back with you over there.
Sit down, kid.
Don't make noise.
Good job.
Nice job, Nicholas. You're on the crew.
We'll give you credit at the end of the movie.
All right.
Okay, so why don't you just start by introducing yourself and telling us what you do and where we are maybe.
My name is Mark Wrathall. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of California, Riverside.
And what do you focus on in your teaching here?
I specialize in existentialism, phenomenology, 20th century philosophy, especially German philosophy. But I'm interested in issues, really, more than the history of philosophy. I'm interested in language, the nature of language, the nature of mind, how to live a worthwhile life, how we should understand religion. I'm very interested in art and law and society, so all sorts of things.
So yeah, that's great, because a lot of philosophers, unfortunately, I don't think of philosophy in the same way as the general public does. That it's very technical, and I think it's good that people are reminded of philosophy as a search for meaning and a worthwhile life. Can you talk a little bit about the philosophical tradition, the way starting with Plato, the dominant tradition about thinking about the world of subjects and objects and theory and things having properties, and just how traditional philosophers until before Heidegger looked at the world.
Well, the history of philosophy, starting with Plato, has really focused on thought, focused on ideas. Plato's big breakthrough, his big contribution to philosophy, or one of his big contributions to philosophy, was the theory of forms or ideas. And that was the idea that we understand things and recognize things and can use things only to the extent that we have an idea of what they are. And that's really been a dominant influence in philosophy. So philosophers have thought that we understand the world by getting clear about the way we think about the world, the ideas we have, the concepts we use. And through lots of history of philosophy and lots of changes in philosophy, that's been one very constant theme, that philosophy works through ideas, through argumentation, through the categories of thought. There's been a number of philosophers who have run contrary to that tradition.
But wait, before we go contrary to it, can you talk a little bit about how did the tradition starting with Plato see the way we encounter like objects in the world and even ourselves as things with properties, and that we, you see where I'm going with this?
I think so. Right, so it doesn't occur to most ordinary people to worry about this, but philosophers are very concerned to understand how it is that we engage with objects in the world, how it is that we encounter objects. So most of us don't think about it. We just sit down in the chair and at the table and pick up the fork and the spoon and work with them. Philosophers are very interested in thinking, well, how can that happen? How is it that these minds up here somewhere in us, in our soul, manage to get out there into the world and grab a hold of these physical objects? And the history of philosophy is a history of all sorts of interesting moves to be made in thinking about that problem. But one very common traditional theme is that there's a very strict, distinct division between us and our thoughts and objects in the world. So subjects and objects is one way that division gets understood. And so philosophers, it seems, at a certain level, it seems common sense that somehow light waves bounce off objects and they excite photoreceptors in the retina of our eye, and then it sets off some sort of chemical reaction in the brain, and then somewhere in conscious experience, a representation of the object forms, an idea of the object. That's a very traditional way to think about it.
And so that this way of looking at the world dominated for the last 2,500 years. Right?
Yeah, and probably still does dominate. And most philosophers think in these terms. Most people, if you ask them to think about it, they think we're conscious minds and we have images or representations of the world in our brain. We're not very clear on the details of how it works, but that's the way I think most people think, probably as a result of the philosophical tradition.
And so what happened, though, in the early 20th century that challenged this way of looking at this?
Well, there's a number of philosophers who think there are problems with this, and philosophy has recognized all along that there are problems in working out the details of this account. Once you start really thinking about it, there are certain things that it's very hard to account for. A very important movement in philosophy was the existential phenomenological movement, and those are big words, but it really comes back to some German philosophers. It started in Germany, who believed that approaching our encounter with the world in terms of ideas was wrong. That we have a kind of understanding of the world which is prior to any ideas or concepts that we might form. That our bodies, our ways of being, get attuned to the world. And there's a kind of understanding there that we can't explain. We're very poor at articulating, but we understand. We've got a grasp of the world that is independent of the thoughts that we have, the thoughts that we think.
And so can you, let's just mention Heidegger and being in time and what that, how revolutionary that was in the history of philosophy, and maybe a couple of minutes on why. I mean, you've already explained it a little bit, but if we could just place him in that context, it would be great.
Yeah, Heidegger, Martin Heidegger was a German philosopher. In 1927, he published a book called Being and Time, which was a landmark in 20th century philosophy, one of the most influential works in philosophy in the last 100 years, and maybe it's one of the most important books. And a major theme of the book was attacking this idea that we've been talking about. It was arguing that you can't account for our experience of the world starting from ideas, starting from thoughts, and reconstructing it as a kind of mental image or mental representation.
And instead, how do we... So Heidegger talks about a basic thing like hammering and the way a carpenter encounters his tools. Can you give a little bit of an example of how the tradition would look at that, at the way we learn and utilize a skill like that versus the way Heidegger would explain?
Yeah, one of Heidegger's favorite examples is the hammer, and using a hammer. If you think about a hammer in a philosophical way, or what people would call a commonsensical way, you'd look at the properties the hammer has, the shape it has, the color it has, and you'd try to construct an understanding we have of the hammer as somehow sticking together all these different ideas of properties. And Heidegger said, that's wrong. If you want to see what a hammer is, you don't think about the properties, you don't describe it, you don't explain it, you pick it up and you start driving nails with it. And you really only see what the hammer is when you have the skills to hammer well. And without those, the hammer will never really show itself to you.
So you only see it as a hammer if you have the skills to use it as a hammer?
You only genuinely see it as a hammer if you have the skills for hammering.
And seeing it as a hammer doesn't mean seeing its properties.
That's right. Understanding it as a hammer in the most authentic sense means understanding how to move your body, how to move your hand, how to grasp the hammer, how hard to strike it, how to swing it. Anyone who's ever tried to hammer for the first time understands what a complicated skill that is. Right? It's not easy at all. And when you watch an amateur hammering compared to a carpenter who really knows how to hammer, you can see the difference. The hammer, it almost looks different, right? It feels different in the hand once you have the skills for using it.
And the tradition might see the hammer as this set of not only its properties and ideas, but that are like centered on the actual object, whereas Heidegger talked about equipmental totality, right? Which is also jargon that needs to be unwrapped, but the idea that we have that the hammer doesn't make sense outside of a context of all the things that the hammer, everything from the nail to the wood to houses and carpenters, and can you explain a little bit of that?
Right. Yeah. The way I like to put it, this is more jargon, but I like to say Heidegger had a relational ontology, which means ontology is a doctrine of what things are, of being. And Heidegger's view was everything is what it is only in the relationships it has to other things. So the tradition wanted to say the table right here or the hammer, that has properties it possesses in and of itself. And those are its core properties, and that's what makes it what it is. Heidegger's view is nothing has any properties in and of itself. It only has properties as it relates to other things. So the hammer is a hammer because it drives nails into boards, and it's used by hands that belong to carpenters who are building particular sorts of things. And unless you understand that whole context of equipment and activities and goals that humans have and roles and social roles that people fill, without an understanding of that, you can't understand what the hammer is.
Or the table or anything.
Or the table or anything else. Or the people.
So now it seems that the tradition had its culmination sometime in the 50s and 60s when the computer was invented. All of a sudden, it seemed like such almost a cliche of what everything that we've said about the tradition to say that, oh wow, here's something we've invented that duplicates exactly how the mind works, and so now we can program a computer to think and behave just like a human, and then they thought, well, you know, and if you just a few years' time, we're going to be able to have computers that think and act and are as skillful as human beings. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, so the great thing about being a philosopher is it's very hard to test what we say, right? You can say anything you want, and we're usually dealing in such abstract, general things that you can, you can believe whatever you want. You never have to prove it. The theories of the mind have been put to the test with the development of the computer, or so it seems. To a lot of people, it seemed like the computer finally offered us a chance to construct a mind using as our model all the philosophical theories we've developed. Bert Dreyfus's genius was recognizing that this was what was going on, that with the efforts to develop artificial intelligence using computers, really we were finally in a position to test thousands of years of philosophical theory about how the mind works.
So how did the programmers see the world, and how did that coincide with the philosophical tradition, and then how did Bert object to that?
Well, the idea was that what programmers were doing was trying to make a computer intelligent by giving it the kind of thoughts that they thought humans had. So they programmed concepts into the computers. They programmed rules into the computers for combining concepts, and thought that by doing this we could reconstruct the sort of understanding of the world that humans have. And if Heidegger was right and the existentialist phenomenological tradition was right and Bert Dreyfus was right, you couldn't do that, because the understanding of the hammer never resided in the ideas and concepts and thoughts we had for thinking and talking about hammers. So Dreyfus predicted that the project would fail, and it looks like he was right.
But let's just expand on this a little bit. You had people who were just like programming one at a time a bunch of properties about the world and thinking that would be enough to actually have intelligent understanding of that. Can you talk a little bit about how did they go about this, and what were their goals on this immediate level, and what actually were they thinking that they could do, and what then they couldn't do?
Well, I'm not really an expert in this, but
okay,
but
go for it.
yeah. So the general idea was, let's sit down, let's think about all the if we think about this room here, what are all the things we can think that we understand about the room, and then we'll put them into the them into the computer. So you'd make an exhaustive list of, if I sat down and in reflecting on the room, what are all the facts I'd list? There's a table in the room. The table is brown. The table is hard. The table is this size, and I sit in front of the table. You can see that this could go on for a very, very long time, trying to list everything that you could think of when it comes to thinking about the room. And I think the hope was that once we got enough of those facts into the computer, that the computer would start acting like we do, understanding like we do. And I think one of the problems is that there's always something more you could think about the room, right? You can make your list, and then someone might ask you a new question that it just hadn't occurred to you to think of. And I think this is the problem they're having in that traditional approach to artificial intelligence, is there's an endless set of things you could think about the room. And then it's a problem knowing, because we don't, when we're dealing with the room, we automatically know which thing we're supposed to be focusing on. But the computer doesn't know that. You're going to have to program that in and help the computer sort through all the millions of facts about a room that you've programmed in. Give them a program for dealing with all these facts, and so it's a very difficult problem to approach intelligence in that way.
So on the one hand, Bert criticized and correctly predicted that this approach was not working, right? So that's like, I would see that as the negative side, right? But on the positive side, we have this amazing ability as humans to do these incredible things. That now it's maybe there's an appreciation after this, looking at the world in this way, at how rich our skills and practices are, and context, and our ability to understand everything, and that this gives us a life that actually has meaning through giving us something to do, and have something make more sense to do than something else, and also just telling us who we are. I'm a professor, I'm a carpenter, I'm a musician. Can we try and connect this understanding of the world that's not theoretical to the way we humans interact with the world and assume identities? Is that, I know that's a big question.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure what the question is.
The question is, does learning these skills, like hammering, contribute to a life that orders what we do? So, for example, a carpenter hammers because he's a carpenter. How does hammering make him a carpenter, or does being a carpenter make him hammer? What's the relationship between our skills and our rich, meaningful existences, let's say?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah.
Understanding the relationship between our skills and what makes existence worthwhile. There's a number of things.
Let's not go that big. Let's
Okay.
just say between our skills and our identity. What does it mean to have an identity, and what is it that's unique about humans that says we think about who we are and we take a stance on it, right? And part of how we do that is through these very basic skills that then maybe are developed into more complex skills.
Okay. Well, one thing skills do is open up the world for you in a way that it's not. It doesn't show itself to you if you lack the skills. So again, think of the skills that a craftsman has, a craftsperson, as they learn how to work with wood, how to hammer, how to use the equipment. They'll start to see things that someone without those skills doesn't see. They'll become receptive to features of the environment that other people aren't in a position to notice. And that will become distinctive of who they are. They become someone who inhabits a world differently as a result of the skills that they have.
And can you talk a little bit more about the importance of that, responding to the unique situation that also the computer is not able to do? I think that's one of the things that Dreyfus talked a lot about, is that humans have this, again, on the positive side, we have this incredible ability to behave skillfully in completely new situations that we haven't had rules programmed in how to do that. We are able to just deal with it in a new way. How does that work?
Well, rules work by ignoring details, ignoring differences between things. Rules work by getting you to recognize general qualities, general characteristics of things, and relating things understood in this general rule-governed way to responses and to actions. So if you're trying to teach someone how to use a hammer, you might give them a rule. If you're If you're driving nails of a certain diameter, use a hammer of a certain sort of weight. Okay, so that what the rule does is divides the world up into these general sorts of categories. What anyone who's very skilled in a domain knows is that being very skilled means responding not just in general terms to the situation, but responding very specifically to what the situation demands. So a chef working in the kitchen can't go by the rules in the cookbook. They have to be aware of all the minute differences in the ingredients they're working with, in the humidity, the altitude, the temperature that they're cooking with, and be constantly adjusting what they're doing to the unique requirements of the situation. An athlete knows that the way you play the game depends on the court you're playing on, the field you're playing on, the opponents you're playing with, the weather, right? All sorts of things that it's probably impossible to even list. So rule-governed behavior rules out the ability to really be an expert. And again, this is one of Bert Dreyfus's great insights, is recognizing this and recognizing that as long as we were trying to model human intelligence on the basis of mastery of rules or understanding of rules, we were sort of shutting ourselves off from higher levels of skillful engagement with the world.
Wow, perfect. You want to take a drink of water or
Sure.
a second? How are we doing on
Me?
on everything? Yeah, just want to because this is going very well on the philosophy level. I want to make sure the technical level is also going well.
Yeah?
Are you happy?
Yeah, I could use a water. What happened to that? How did everybody tell?
You gave it to me.
Oh, I see.
You're so good at explaining this stuff in a clear way. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
See, guys?
You guys having fun or bored?
They make fun of me because they don't think I explain things well.
No, you're the best of all the people we've interviewed so far. Your dad's the best. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about. Okay, so you explained well how skills give us identities. Can we say anything about the way is there a relationship between our identities and having and meaning? I mean, it seems like on the basic level, you know, the significance of objects is related to our skills with them, and then on an upper level, our skills tell us who we are, just much in the same way as our skills might tell us what the hammer is, but on a higher level, and that knowing who we are gives some sort of deeper significance to our lives. Is that too much of a jump?
Well, I don't know. This is a field that figuring out what makes life significant, that's a very difficult issue in philosophy. I'm not sure it requires knowing who you are, at least if knowing means having this reflective understanding of who you are.
But we've determined that that's not what this is. I mean, having
That's
the
right.
identity is not thinking about how you do something, and nor is it necessarily thinking about why you do it. Maybe you just, I mean, can we talk a little bit about the culture and how it sets up the way one does things, and the tension between, I mean, on the positive level, that helps us have intelligible behavior, and on the other hand, we are unique human beings and we do things in our way, and if there's some insights about that's
All right.
that's a lot.
Yeah.
Already.
Well, I'm not sure there's.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure there's any one way to have a meaningful life, but I think one of the ways to have a meaningful life is to encounter things in the world which matter to you, things that you can use to fulfill who you are, and as you acquire skills, as you become, you get into the groove of a certain way of being in the world, right? As you your life comes to depend on particular kinds of activities and relating to people and relating to things in the world, then what happens is the world, I think, gets organized into things that matter and things that don't matter, things which are essential to your exercising the skills you have for engaging with the world, and things which don't figure in your experience of the world. So I think that there probably is a correlation between being very skillful at something, being a master of something, and finding things in the world which are deeply significant, deeply meaningful, and essential to your being who you are.
Now, so far we've talked about individuals mainly. I mean, like, the carpenter does his woodwork and encounters objects as the things that matter to him, and the hammer to hammer. But we also we're not alone in the world. We have communities, and we have practices that only make sense in terms of that community. It seems that there's also much a parallel between there having to be a context between objects. There has to be a context also between human beings, a society where roles make sense, and let me so it seems like skills lead to practices. The chef doesn't just cook for himself, but he cooks in order to create a meal for the people coming to the restaurant, or the person cooks at home for their family, and that leads to a practice where people sit around a table, which is the practice of dinner, and then all of a sudden everyone's roles make more sense from the father and mother and the children, or in a restaurant there's all sorts of roles, from the waiter to the cook to and it seems to organize life in that way. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things going on. One is there's a sense of community that grows out of people having distinct skills and becoming very, very good at doing something, and other people come to rely on them. We become tied into communities where we rely on each other to exercise the skills we have to enrich the lives of all of us. So again, to take an example, this is an example I think I got from Albert Borgman, but there was a time in the history of our culture where if you wanted to enjoy music, you needed to get a bunch of people who could play music, right? You'd get someone to play the violin and someone to play the bass and someone to play the flute, and you'd have to get together and you'd have to practice, and so these people would get locked into a community where they relied on each other, and then other people would gather around them to enjoy the music. What technology does is free us from needing skills to enjoy things, to consume things. So now if you want music, you click your mouse and download whatever you want to hear, and we lose that sort of rich connection with other people in the community. So that's one way in which I think skills bring us as human beings together, make us depend on each other, make people matter to us, because there's someone who has a skill that I need in order to enjoy life more fully. There's something else that happens with mastery, and I don't fully understand this, but there's a sort of sense of human wonder that comes in being in the presence of someone who is a master at something, who is able to see things that the rest of us don't see, is able to understand just the right thing to do in the situation. And these people, I think, have always drawn us and amazed us, and that's why we pay money to go to sporting events and watch great masters who have skill at sports, or why we're drawn to watch great musicians perform, or eat the food. That's the creation of a great chef, right? There's just a sort of awe and amazement that comes in the presence of a human being who's achieved a level of skill that lets them disclose the world in a way that the rest of us are oblivious to and weren't aware of. And that also can bring people together, and will gather around those sorts of great individuals to have the world opened up to us.
And it gives and it makes sense of the practices in a way. I mean, can you talk a little bit about the way, again, there seems to be this tension between, we have a world where we need to have what Heidegger calls the one, of how one does things, otherwise we would not be able to function, right? We all have to have a certain agreement on how things work and what place things have in our culture. But then these people come along who somehow are able to absorb all of that and then move beyond it, so that things it still makes sense what they do. Like the great basketball player is still playing by the rules of the game to a certain sense, but somehow he's transforming it and redefining it. And how does that play work between the banality of how we have to live in a shared world and shared understanding, and someone doing something exceptionally and thereby redefining how we do things?
Well, there's a real tension in societies between conformism and individualism. And in order for society to function, there has to be a considerable amount of regularity in human behavior. We have to all have to drive on the same side of the road, and we all have to follow the rules in order for society to work well. But there is a sense that the mindless conformism is dehumanizing and destroys what's great about us and unique about us. So we value individuality as well. But there's a tension there. If everybody's an individual, then you lose the benefits that come from shared adherence to rules and shared norms and values. So there's always a tension going on there. I think there's a class of experts who somehow overcome that tension by seeing what our social norms, what our shared rules are really all about. And so they're able to inhabit the rules, but realize that there's a true expression of the rules that goes beyond just mindlessly conforming to what everybody thinks one should do in the situation. And those people, I think, also deservedly get attention, get awe, because they somehow see what our culture is really about and can manifest it in a way that doesn't just blindly follow the rules, but still remains true to the spirit of the rules. The example of an athlete, I think, is a good illustration of this. Athletes are rule-bound, rule-governed. You can't play the game unless you're following the rules. But the great athletes see a way to express something about the game within the confines of the rules, but in a way that other people hadn't thought to do or aren't able to do.
It seems to me there's a relationship between what we were talking about at the very beginning about having to, maybe when you're first learning something, having to apply rules and think about things like the tradition thinks about them, in a not flowing way, in this like subject-object way of and then there's this. And then the master. Hold on, let me try and rephrase this a second. There's. Pause for 1 second. I need to gather my thoughts.